بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Inshallah, today we'll be going on to our next letter, which is the letter Ra. So today we'll discuss how is Ra pronounced. Then we'll discuss how Ra Mutaharrik and Ra Sakin are pronounced. And finally, we are going to discuss two incorrect pronunciations of the letter Ra. The one thing we're not going to discuss, because that's a whole separate topic, is the heavy and light forms of Ra, and when is a Ra heavy and light. Generally speaking, there's 8 situations where it's heavy, 4 situations where it's light, and 2 situations where it's up to you. But we're not going to go into that because that's a whole separate thing. Right now, we're just going to discuss how to pronounce Ra, generally speaking. Some of the examples will be when it's heavy. Some of the examples are when they're light. Anyway, first thing is, how is Ra pronounced? So firstly, Ra is pronounced when there's contact made between, number one, the front of the tongue, the front part of the tongue, and number two, the gums behind the upper teeth. The gums behind the upper. So you have your upper teeth and then the gums that are right on top of there. And if you want to know exactly where, this area is right behind where the noon is. So if you say the letter noon, like an, so wherever your tongue is, bring it a bit higher. So where noon is, an, wherever that tongue is, bring it slightly higher, and that's where Ra is pronounced from. So noon would be somewhere like right here, and Ra would be a bit above, like somewhere around. It's not an exact picture, of course, but it's a bit behind the noon. So that's where Ra is pronounced. When your tongue touches that area, a Ra is pronounced. When pronouncing a Ra, the middle of the tongue ends up going down. This is natural. It naturally happens because when you're moving your tongue so high up into your mouth, the middle part of it automatically has to curve in because your tongue is too long. Because your tongue is too long and you're trying to push your tongue, the front part up, it's automatically going to curve down a bit. So that's what happens when you pronounce Ra. So that is the letter Ra, right? Ra. So now let's actually go through examples of the Mutaharrik and Sakin situations. Oh, actually, sorry, before we get into that, I want to discuss a few more details about pronouncing Ra. So one very important thing is when pronouncing Ra, a small opening is left in the center. So if actually look here, this is your tongue. This is the actual tongue, and that tongue has actually been raised up and is touching the top part of the mouth. So if you see right in the middle over here, there is a slight, very small opening. There's a very small opening. So that opening is where the sound of the Ra has to come out from. That's where the air and the sound of the Ra actually comes out from. For example, in Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, you should be able to constantly say the Ra. So that sound. So that's coming from that small little opening. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. So that's coming from that small opening. So what's happening is your tongue blocks off the sound from coming out from the sides, and it redirects it towards the center. In Tajweed, this is called inhiraf. Inhiraf means to take something and deviate it. So your tongue takes the sound and makes it go through that tiny little area. That's called inhiraf. And that is how the letter Ra is pronounced. So now let's actually take some examples where it's mutaharrik and sakin so we can see it a bit better. So when Ra has a haraka, release the tongue from that area, wherever it's on top of that area, and then make the appropriate motion for the haraka. Ra. Rahim now. So your tongue was on the top, but when you had to say the Ra, you had to let it go from there. Ra. Rahim nahum. With a dhamma, ru. Rubama. Rubama. So you can kind of feel the air on top. Rubama. I'm exaggerating a bit so you can hear it. Rubama. Rubama. The next example is with a kasra. Rima. Rima. So that sound is coming. Rimahukum. Rimahukum. So those are examples with a fatha, dhamma, and a kasra. Next is when a ra is sakin. Then in that situation, the tongue remains on the upper teeth while the sound of the ra is produced. For example, sar, sar. So sar, you should be able to carry the sound. Sar, sar. If you can't carry it, that means something wrong is happening, which inshallah will go through in the next two slides. And I sometimes mess up on this too over and over. But anyway, Sarmadan, Sarmadan. So Sarmadan. Obviously, when you say it while you're reciting, it will be much faster. You won't stretch the ra. It'll just be Sarmadan. Next example is when it has a kasra before it. Lam lam tu dhir, dhirhum. So again, dhir. You can carry the sound. Dhir, dhir. You can carry it. Right? That's coming out from that little center opening. Dhirhum. Next is one with dhamma before it. Wa dhur, dhur, dhur. So you should be able to dhur, dhur. That sound should be coming. So obviously, when you're reciting again, it's not that apparent and it's much faster. Wa dhur now. It's done. But that little air should be coming out from the top of the mouth. That is a part of the pronouncing a ra. So that is how you pronounce the ra. That's mutaharrik and sakin. Now let's go into two very popular incorrect pronunciations of the letter ra. So the first incorrect pronunciation, now it's the same picture I brought from before. So if the tongue does not properly make contact with the gums on top, right? Some people, when they recite the ra, their tongue does not fully touch the top of the mouth. Either it's touching it very lightly or it's not touching it at all. When that happens, a wow sound comes out. Instead of being Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, they say Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. That means your tongue is not high enough. If you say Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, shawwi, 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 it's like you're mixing it with a wow. That is incorrect. That means your tongue is not going high enough to produce the ra. It's too low because of that, there's a mix between a ra and a wow sound coming out. So the tongue has to go higher. So that is one incorrect pronunciation of a ra. Second one is more common, which I accidentally do a lot as well. If too much force is applied to the ra, then what happens is that little opening that we see there, that little opening that's there, it ends up closing. When it closes, a strong sound comes out, and that actually ends up creating multiple ra's. An example, I'm going to exaggerate. An example of this would be, instead of saying Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, so instead of saying Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, someone's tongue fully goes on top. What sound's going to come out? Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. That means your tongue is touching too much. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Min sharri, even though it's supposed to be light. Min sharri. That multiple ra that's coming, that means the tongue, you've completely closed off this little area that's there because you're putting too much pressure. Most people, when they're learning a ra the first time, this happens a lot with them. They do it over and over and over. They're gonna say wa dhur, dhur, that little motorboat motion. Dhur. Now that's incorrect because too much pressure is being applied on the tongue and it's touching the top. In Tajweed, this mistake where you make multiple ra's because you're putting too much pressure, it's called takrar. Takrar means repetition because you're creating multiple ra's. Ar-Rahman nir. No one does it that much, but it can happen. Ar-Rahman nir-Rahim. Nir-Rahim. You're creating multiple ra's because of too much force. That's called takrar, and that is an incorrect way of pronouncing a ra. Finally, the correct pronunciation, which we went through before, I thought I would point it out once more. So that small opening that's on top at the center of the tongue, so our tongue is right there, and there's a small opening right here. That little opening should be there for the air to come out. You will not do this intentionally. It's tough to do it intentionally. But when you push the air out, you have to do it in such a light way where that opening allows the air to fully come out. At the same time, the rest of the gum will still be touching the top of the gum. So the side part, it's still touching the top, but the middle part is allowing the air and the sound to come out. That little, I'm exaggerating. Ar-Rahma, so that sometimes that happens. So that little sound you're hearing. Ar-Rahma, nir. So that you're kind of hearing. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. So that sound is shows that you're actually pronouncing a ra. If you put too much force, it's going to turn into ar nir. That's wrong. If you put too little force, it's going to be ar-Rahmanir Rahim. It has to be in the middle. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Ar-Rahmanir nir ar. So it's a very light force. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Of course, you're not supposed to stretch it, but I'm trying to show the little air that's coming out. This concept of air coming through the center of the raw center for the raw sound is called takreer. Takreer means a shiver. It means like a shivering sound. It's like it's a little vibration that's happening right on the top of your mouth. That shiver is part of pronouncing a ra. If you make it too strong, it's going to turn into takrar, which is wrong, which is multiple ras. You have to keep it light, a light takreer. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Right? Without the stretching, I'm stretching to show the ra. But Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Ar-Rahmanir. So that shiver, that shivering sound is called takreer, and that is part of pronouncing a ra. Again, of course, this requires practice. No one will get it in one shot if they've never learned it before. So this is the pronunciation of the letter ra. So inshallah, I'll end here, and tomorrow we will move on to the next